Keanu Reeves had never been one to shy away from a challenge, but what he was about to face was unlike anything he had encountered before. The discovery of corporate corruption and political negligence in the wake of LA's devastating wildfires had shaken him to his core. But even as the dust settled from his initial revelations, the fight was far from over. Keanu knew he had only scratched the surface. The press conference that had exposed the shocking details about corporate greed and the lack of support for firefighters had sent shockwaves across the nation. Public outcry was at an all-time high, and Keanu's involvement had turned him into an unlikely hero. But for all the attention his findings had garnered, the most powerful players behind the scenes were just beginning to mobilize against him. Keanu's initial discovery of the corporate ties that had influenced fire management and the aftermath of the fires had been groundbreaking, but it had also stirred a hornet's nest. The corporate giants, including real estate developers, powerful insurance companies, and energy firms, were quick to respond. They had long operated in the shadows, pulling the strings behind government policies and emergency response decisions, and they weren't about to let an outsider expose them without a fight. At first, Keanu thought the backlash would come from anonymous threats or from smear campaigns designed to discredit him. But soon, the fight became much more personal. Keanu's private life, once guarded from the public eye, was now under constant scrutiny. His family, friends, and even his colleagues in Hollywood were being dragged into the mess. Keanu had always kept his personal life private, and the intrusion was a harsh reminder of the stakes involved. But the more intense the pressure grew, the more determined he became to see this through. The more Keanu dug into the corporate networks, the more horrifying the truth became. He had already learned that some companies were profiting off of disaster, purchasing land in fire-prone areas and then reaping the benefits of insurance payouts after the land was scorched. But as his investigation deepened, he uncovered a pattern of negligence that ran much deeper than simple greed. What Keanu had uncovered was a widespread conspiracy to exploit the very system that was meant to protect the people. In one of his most shocking discoveries, Keanu learned about a secret network of whistleblowers within the real estate sector who had been paid off to keep quiet about shady deals involving government officials and developers. It was a system designed to funnel billions of dollars from taxpayers into the pockets of a few powerful people. Through fake environmental reports and bribes to local officials, developers were getting permits for land in high-risk zones, places that were supposed to be off-limits due to their vulnerability to wildfires. But this corruption wasn't limited to land deals. Keanu uncovered disturbing evidence of manipulated fire safety reports, where firefighting equipment and personnel were being underfunded or redirected away from high-risk areas. It wasn't a simple case of bad management. It was a coordinated effort to maximize profits for companies at the cost of lives. The documents showed that fire-prone areas were deliberately neglected in favor of development projects. There were emails between fire department officials and developers discussing how to delay fire prevention measures in order to make room for new construction. Even worse, Keanu discovered that key decision-makers in the fire department were directly involved in these backdoor dealings. Keanu's mind raced as he pieced everything together. This wasn't just corporate greed. It was systemic corruption that had put thousands of lives in danger for years. The realization made him more resolute. He wasn't going to let these corporations get away with it. Keanu knew the power of Hollywood and the media, and he intended to use every ounce of influence he had to expose the truth. His next step was to go public with the evidence he had gathered. But even before he could make his move, he was contacted by a former firefighter who had worked through multiple fire seasons. The firefighter, whose identity Keanu kept confidential, had been an eyewitness to how certain fires had been allowed to burn unchecked. He shared chilling stories about how fire breaks were intentionally ignored in some areas, only for those same areas to be targeted for development projects later on. The firefighter also revealed that many of the so-called fire-safe developments were built on land that should never have been touched, with shoddy construction and subpar materials used to cut costs. As Keanu sifted through the new evidence, his heart sank. The depth of the conspiracy was staggering. It wasn't just that the developers had neglected fire prevention measures. It was that they had knowingly put entire communities at risk in order to line their pockets. The people who had been making these decisions weren't just rogue individuals. They were highly placed figures within the city's government, all with deep ties to the developers and energy firms that had a vested interest in seeing these lands developed. The corruption didn't stop there. Keanu's investigation also revealed a shocking cover-up involving major insurance companies. These companies had long been in bed with developers, profiting off of wildfires by raising premiums in fire-prone areas. But even more egregious was the discovery that these companies had been manipulating their claims process to ensure that the victims of the fires were underpaid, leaving them struggling to rebuild while the insurance companies pocketed the difference. Keanu's stomach churned as he read the email exchanges between insurance executives, discussing how they could manage the claims process to avoid paying out on large-scale fires. But the most heart-wrenching part of his findings was the stories of survivors, families who had been left to fend for themselves while the city and corporations turned a blind eye. Keanu had spoken to dozens of fire victims, many of whom had lost everything. One woman, whose husband and children were killed in a fire, shared her story of how emergency services had failed them. Despite repeated calls to 911, no help had arrived. Keanu knew that the lives lost in these fires were not just the result of natural disasters. They were the result of a broken system, one that had been exploited for profit at the expense of ordinary people. As Keanu's investigation gained momentum, the pressure on him only increased. He started receiving more direct threats, anonymous phone calls, intimidating messages, and even attempts to hack his personal devices. He was followed by shadowy figures, and one evening, a group of men in black SUVs attempted to run him off the road. Keanu knew that these weren't just the actions of people desperate to silence him. These were the tactics of powerful organizations that would stop at nothing to protect their interests. Despite the threats, Keanu's resolve grew stronger. He knew the only way to stop the cycle of corruption and greed was to expose it to the world. He gathered his team of journalists, environmental experts, and legal activists and prepared to release a bombshell report. The documents they had collected painted a damning picture of a city and a country that had been held hostage by corporate interests. The night before the report was scheduled to go live, Keanu received an unexpected call. It was from a high-ranking official who had been involved in the conspiracy. The official begged Keanu to stop, claiming that the repercussions of exposing the full scope of the corruption would lead to chaos and violence. Keanu listened but knew that the truth had to be told, no matter the cost. When the report finally dropped, the world was left reeling. The headlines screamed of the corporate greed, political negligence, and lives lost due to corruption. The images of burned homes and the faces of survivors flooded every news channel. People were furious, demanding accountability from the companies and officials who had turned a blind eye to the fires. Social media exploded with support for Keanu, with hashtags like aka Keanu exposes, the truth, and justice for the survivors trending worldwide. But even with the public behind him, Keanu knew that this was just the beginning. The corporate giants were already gearing up for a fight, and they would use every tactic at their disposal to protect their wealth and influence. Keanu had become more than just a celebrity whistleblower. He had become the face of a movement. He was ready for the fight of his life, but he knew it would take more than just one man to bring about real change. The people were with him, and together, they would take on the forces that had been exploiting the system for far too long. As Keanu Reeves prepared for the next phase of his battle, he knew one thing for certain. This fight was far from over. The truth was out, but the struggle for justice had only just begun.